I've just sent off what I hope is the final proof of the Abramelin diaries, which are going to be published at the end of the year. Now, you notice I'm in a different room. Having had a burglary, a flood, damp rising, a fire in my old office, and endless computer problems, and also 2 operations and a lot of financial hardship. It's very tempting for me to sort of blame all that on the Abramelin demons as I struggle to complete this job. But actually, the rest of the world's been having a pretty bad time as well as me, so I can hardly blame the whole thing on the demons. Anyway, I'm very glad to get it behind me. But as I was doing it, I was thinking, why would anyone be interested in my struggles of 40 years ago? Struggles to try to maintain a simple discipline against the background of fairly normal life. Apart from anything one might say about the spiritual benefit and what I gained, I think there was real value in simply trying to set oneself to a schedule, a practice, and keep it up for 6 months. Life doesn't give you many opportunities to do that. We're told we live in a time of choice, and there's so much choice we have. But actually, there's also an awful lot of pressure from bureaucracy, from police, from social media, the internet, awful lot of pressure to do other things. And I think it's very common that people decide they're going to set out on some practice, whether it's keeping fit or meditating, whatever, and it fizzles out after a while. And one of the ways people try to get around that is to use crowd support. A lot of apps encourage you, to not only, measure your fitness every day, but also to form a community of friends to support each other. And that, I suppose, is one way of doing it. But when it comes to the Abramelin, you're doing something very individual. Now that in itself, I think, is very valuable. That feeling that at times I was doing something immensely boring and frustrating and feeling that I was a failure. And yet, unlike office work and so much that one has to do, it was something I decided to do for myself, by myself. And that was a real challenge. I was carving an individual path in a world which makes it really very difficult to do that. In Thundersqueak, I talked about, at one stage, the age of Pisces. And this idea that the age of Pisces, the opposing sign to Pisces, is Virgo. And that Virgo, the figure of the independent woman, the virago, if you like, was often a sort of shadow to the age of Pisces. And that people sometimes say one of the successes of the Catholic Church is that it managed to incorporate that shadow, sort of combining the Virgin with the Mother and making it safe. But in many other cases, as the witchcraft trials, the independent, free woman was seen as a challenge, was seen as a threat to the order. And in Thundersqueak, I said, if we're moving to the age of Aquarius, what is the opposite sign to Aquarius? It is Leo, supremely the sign of the individual, compared with the collective of Aquarius, the individual and the king. And I suggested that the big problem of the next 2,000 years would be the individual versus society. That the individual would be the sort of the shadow, the feared opposite to Aquarius, the social, the collective. And I see that looking back now in 2 ways. One is that the more people get en masse, the more they're inclined to yearn for a king. in the form maybe of a diva, a rock star, a film star, some star person or a sports star that they can fall behind to play the king for them. The other side of it is that it becomes more and more dangerous to be seen as an individual, a loner, particularly now with sort of terrorism fears. How often when someone has, I don't know, done one of these school shootouts and killed people, when people are saying, well, what was he like? And the one common thing they tend to pick on, well, he was a bit of a loner, as though being a loner means you're more inclined to go and shoot people. It's become a sort of a dangerous thing. And of course, the Abramelin operation is very much about making oneself a loner for a number of months. There's an emphasis on privacy, but there's also a big challenge of privacy. As I point out in my volume, which is coming out, my instinct was, when I read it and decided I was going to do this, I must find a lonely place in the country where I can completely withdraw from society to do this. And I still think that would be a fantastic thing to do. And you would get more manifestations if you did that, because it is when you're on your own that real spiritual manifestations and magic can happen more easily. As soon as you're in anything normal or with normal people around you, there's a very strong normalizing influence, and much less peculiar stuff, weird stuff is likely to happen. So, of course, that's what I should do. I should go and do this completely isolated. But I realized in the short time I had to get ready, this is very, very difficult nowadays, particularly in a crowded country like Britain. I realized that I would be more invisible in a town or simply staying in the suburban place I was living in on a village green in Hertfordshire. I'd be more invisible there than if I went off to find a quiet place in the woods where eventually I would attract attention by being apparently a fugitive living in the woods. People in the village I was in were used to seeing me around. And okay, they would see me around a bit more often, but I was just part of the scenery. Whereas if I was in some obscure country in a wood or something, if anyone noticed me, they would be very curious about what I was doing. So that's the first thing, the question of privacy, and trying to achieve a level of privacy in relatively normal circumstances. Now, when I read through my diary, I was appalled at the number of people that were coming to visit. And I thought, oh my God, this isn't a retirement, it was just a wild social life. But actually, that wasn't quite true. I was still sharing a house with a friend who knew what I was doing and knew that I needed to be left alone, and I would spend a lot of time on my own. Because quite apart from the actual time you're doing the orations, you're trying to live in a spiritual way. You're trying to be very conscious of what you're doing and try to make everything you do be directed towards the operation. So he wasn't a problem, but of course we had many mutual friends. So people would come to visit us, really visiting him. And what do? Do I slam the door and go away? No, because that again draws attention to it. So obviously if they were occult friends, I would tell them I'm doing the Abramelin operation and they would know some of the conditions could leave me alone. But it didn't stop them being curious. They were interested. Now, for more general friends, I could say something like, because they knew me a bit, I'm doing a sort of meditating thing, and I've got a strict routine, so if you forgive me, I won't hang around. And I could mostly get away with that. But otherwise, the more I made it clear that I was wanting to be alone, the more interesting I became, and I had to balance that. And that is the real challenge which I faced during those 6 months. Well, one of the real challenges, the other was simply getting up on time. But this thing of balancing privacy against being in society and society being curious and a little suspicious. And I think it would be even worse now. People are more suspicious even than they were back then. I wrote this up, I wrote Thundersqueak the year after the operation. And one of the things I mentioned in Thundersqueak, which I've referred to in a recent video, was that I was sort of peeling away layers over those 6 months. It comes across in the book that, things that I identified with, I was peeling them off. Now, see, one of the things society does is it puts labels onto you. I'm British, I'm educated, I am 6 foot tall, and so on and so forth. And these labels reward you. Being British, I have a British passport, and people have in certain areas respect for the British, and therefore I speak English and so on and so forth. But they also become traps. You see, if you identify too much with being British and you put too much importance on that label, you become very easily a victim of a politician who says things like, I'm sorry, I'm not one of these people who's ashamed to be British anymore. I think it's disgraceful, and you sort of, he's beginning to win you over to his side. Whereas actually, what you do in a thing like Abraham Lincoln is you peel off those labels. You say, well, if I'd been born in France, would I be a totally different person? And what I find, what I described in Thundersqueak, is as you peel off these labels, in a sort of Buddhist stance, you're detaching from them. You're no longer being attached to those labels, which means you can still enjoy them. There's certain things that I like about being British, but I'm not so identified with it that people could just say, oh, because you're British, you ought to be doing this or doing that or whatever. Because you're educated, you ought to be this sort of person. You should be thinking in this sort of way. I'm more detached than that. I'm more of an individual. And being more of an individual offers certain rewards. It also means you're more of a threat to society, if you like. But it does mean you have certain freedoms. And the thing that I've found is that stripping off these labels, the fear is, the reason some people cling to these labels is because they're afraid that if they take them off, there'll be nothing left. Whereas actually what you find is that nearly everything is left when you remove these labels. You're getting closer to find the real you, the real humanity. So that was part of the value of doing the Abraham Lincoln. And yet it's the very thing which in a way society fears. And therefore there's a lot of pressure, and it'll come in many different ways. I compared my rather pathetic 6 months in a British suburb to Tenzin Palmo's 3 years, thousands of feet up in the Himalayas, where she really was isolated in a lonely cave, which, it took a struggle to get up to that height, and there was lack of oxygen and things like that. She was living a really, really extreme retirement. And comparing what happened to me to what happened to her, and the end result was not that different. I wouldn't claim that I achieved what she did, but just, the basic thing was not so very different. And yet the amazing thing was that even in that very isolated spot, she didn't manage to complete because a policeman arrived one day, struggled up to her lonely cave and told her that she was going to have to leave the country in so many days because of some visa or permit expired or whatever, so that, the bureaucracy society can get you one way or another, whether it's through the visits that I had of people turning up and me having to sort of balance not whipping up their curiosity and yet managing to sort of keep on my own. Whether it's that or something like the police coming and saying, "Move on, mate, you can't be here." There's tremendous pressures from society to defeat the individual. I say defeat, that's perhaps not the right, to draw the individual back into society, if you like, to put it more positively. But that's one of the big struggles you find if you do something like the Abramelin. And yet, that is one of the things that is most rewarding about doing some sort of a magical retirement.